Now, welcome to World Chef Podcast. I'm your host, Ragnar Fredriksson, and this is World on a Plate. I'm very excited to introduce today's guest. It's Juliane Caillouette Noble. She's the CEO of the Sustainable Restaurant Association, which helps hospitality businesses around the world become more sustainable. Their main tool is the Food Made Good Standard, which we will talk about, which is a sustainability assessment built around the pillars that we will also discuss: the sourcing, society, and the environment. And now used across more than 15,000 kitchens in 40 countries. So it's quite an expansion. Juliane has also been leading the organization since 2016, driving its expansions across all continents. And before that, she spent 5 years running Jamie Oliver's programs for the school food and the food education in the UK. So we're looking forward to hear more about how sustainability is shaping the hospitality sector and what it means for people working in it. So let's get started. And I just want to say, Juliane, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. What a joy to be with you this morning.
Yeah, no, it's been great to follow your organization. It's been a tremendous growth. And let's start talk about the organization and
Yeah.
all the work you've done so far. So you've been around since 2009.
Yes.
So what is the mission today of the organization, and what role does it play in the hospitality sector?
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for having me and for having this opportunity to talk more about the work that we do at the Sustainable Restaurant Association. So, as you say, the SRA has been around since 2009. We began in London, again, kind of almost 18 so years ago. And if you were able to rewind your mind back to 2009 and what it was like in the sort of early 2000 period, um, conversations around sustainability were definitely starting to bubble up, but there wasn't a lot of clarity on what that actually meant or looked like for a hospitality business. And that therefore meant that different businesses were defining that in different ways. You heard businesses that were sort of a sustainable restaurant because it's the beginning of the farm to table movement. They're focusing on where their ingredients come from. At the same time, you started seeing food service players or big corporates starting to talk about corporate social responsibility. And you started to see a sort of increase in that kind of language, a growth in labeling schemes like Fair Trade Foundation and some of the fishing marks that are increasingly prevalent in supermarkets around the world. So it was an interesting sort of nascent time for sustainable hospitality. And the SRA was set up to bring together the industry to actually understand what does it mean to be a sustainable restaurant? What is the intersection of all of the different issues that come to bear within our businesses and in our operations? And therefore, we were created with the mission to drive the hospitality sector towards a future that is both environmentally restorative and socially progressive. So those two things come together to really define what we're talking about when we talk about the word sustainability. Yes, we are talking about our environmental impact as a sector. We are talking about the food that we serve, where it comes from, how it gets into our restaurants, the operations of our restaurant, things like energy, water, waste, etc. But this extra piece around what does it mean to be socially progressive as a sector is a really important part of the definition for us. Because fundamentally, we are an industry filled with people. And if we don't think about the sustainability of the people in our industry, doesn't really matter the impact that we have on the environment because those choices are made by humans every day in our sector. So that is what the SRA sets out to do. We began in London, as I said. We were very UK oriented business up until the pandemic. And in the pandemic, I think our biggest moment as a sector to say, all of these issues that are colliding, that we are facing as restaurants, as hospitality businesses, are actually global in nature. We are a global industry. It is not unusual for us to look around the world and take inspiration from different places. We know that no matter which main market you're looking at, hospitality is staffed by global, citizens around the world. So we see a lot of that movement of people within our industry. And therefore, we need to be having a more global conversation around what good looks like for hospitality. So we used that opportunity when restaurants were closed during the pandemic, or that really tricky operating period between 2020 and 2022, to really interrogate the work that we were doing and saying, how do you make this fit for a global market? How do you push from a UK conversation to an international one? And that sort of relaunched the Food Made Good framework as the Food Made Good standard
Mm.
in the beginning of 2023. We're proud to say that from then, we now have businesses in 49 countries around the world who are using this framework as a way of assessing and understanding their sustainability.
Right. You said food made good framework. So you use that to evaluate businesses. Can you walk us through that and tell us more about how the assessment works and what are the components of the food made good standards?
Absolutely. So the Food Made Good standard fundamentally comes from the idea of asking what is a good restaurant? And, at the end of the day, and when we say good in this context, we are using it in its kind of grandest idea. So we're not talking about what makes the food good in a restaurant, but what makes the restaurant good. And therefore, the assessment is divided into three pillars that sort of structure it. The first is looking at sourcing and the supply chain. At the end of the day, we are food businesses. This is the biggest impact of our businesses in terms of, wider social and environmental impact. It's the work that happens to get the food to our restaurants and onto our plates. The second pillar is the social impact of our businesses. This is where we talk about the people within the hospitality organization and within our sector, as well as our impact on the community outside our doors. So, again, at that beginning of this conversation, we were saying hospitality is fundamentally human. That pillar is looking at our impact on people. The third pillar is operational environmental impact. So this is, I think, where people's brains go when they start to talk about sustainability. They think energy, water, waste, single-use packaging, etc., falls into that operational environmental impact. So if you take that as the core pyramid that we are trying to build when assessing our own operations, no matter what size business you are, whether you're a small business all the way up to a, global multinational hotel chain, for example. So looking at that sourcing section, the way that Food Made Good is structured is to speak to restaurants and operators in very human language. So we're not trying to use a lot of ESG jargon,
Mm.
where because again, we want to talk to chefs, we want to talk to front of house, we want to talk to back of house in terms that actually make a tangible difference to your business. So the first thing that we talk about in Food Made Good is that a good restaurant celebrates provenance. So what does it mean to celebrate provenance? That means to understand where your ingredients are coming from, and how they get to you, how they were farmed and procured, etc., along the way. So that section is really talking about transparency of your supply chain, traceability of your supply chain, the standards that you put in place. So whether those are farming standards or sort of, welfare standards, etc., in your supply chain. From there, you move from celebrating provenance into a good restaurant supports farmers and fishers. So again, what does it mean to have a constructive relationship from the restaurant all the way down to producer level? And that can be your local farmer and producer wherever you are in the world. That also means what is your impact on those farmers and producers that you maybe don't see in your supply chain. So your coffee farmers, your chocolate farmers. So, it starts to really bring in these ideas of what does fair trade look like for our industry. Then from there, in that sourcing section, the next section looks at a good restaurant serves more veg and better meat. And with that, what we mean is that we really want to increase, one of the most sustainable things that we can be doing as a food system is increasing the amount of plants in our diets and reducing down our reliance on animal-based proteins. But this is in a holistic and balanced way that makes sense for our industry. So we want to say, what are we doing to sort of champion and get that diversity onto the plate at the same time as saying when we serve meat in our restaurants, etc., how do we make sure we're serving the best possible? What goes into making those decisions for those animal-based proteins? And then finally, rounding out the sourcing section, if we've just talked about vegetables and meat, now we're going to talk about your seafood and your sort of blue food. So a good restaurant sources seafood sustainably, has a transparent view of the species, the fish, the things that are coming in, and the choices that they're making on their menus. Then you kind of follow that same pattern again. So we're asking the questions of what does good look like in a restaurant? So a good for people looks like treating your staff fairly. That's where we ask questions all about staffing policies, contracts, handbooks. How do we ensure that we create an industry where people can thrive, not just survive at the end of the day? A good restaurant supports their community. So again, this idea that at the end of the day, restaurants are pillars in our community. And I think this is increasingly important over time. We're seeing a sort of increasingly, isolated, lonely, future in our cities. And restaurants are such a strong counteract to that pull of technology and of devices. And then finally, in that social impact section, a good restaurant feeds people well. So again, we have to have some points of view on what does supporting the health and wellness of our clientele look like. That might look different if you're a university canteen to a fine dining restaurant. This is in no way saying that, you should cut butter, salt, and sugar from a once in a lifetime meal opportunity. Of course not. But it is asking those flexible questions about how do you understand balance when it comes to feeding your customers.
Mm.
Then finally, in your energy, water, waste stuff, that's fairly self-explanatory, but good restaurant wastes no food. A good restaurant reduces, reuses, recycles. A good restaurant measures their footprint. So those are the kind of three elements that come into that operationally. All of this is about interrogating your practice as a business. So do you have policies in place? Are you taking actions against, towards these things? I tend to think about actions in two ways. It's what actions are you taking to minimize your harm? Fundamentally, we are taking things out of the earth and we're selling them. Like there is an impact to our businesses. What actions are we taking to minimize that harm? And then what actions are we taking to proactively do good on top of that? And then how do those sort of net out? Uh, all of it is built in a way that should walk you as a restaurant owner, not as a sustainability specialist, through these ideas so that you can embed at every different step of your operation, whether that's from procurement all the way to pot wash, some of these practices that ultimately result in driving a more positive impact for your business.
Mm, mm. That's super impressive and quite visionary. I can confirm. I started working for World Chefs in 2009, and I must admit, because we started our Feed the Planet program, we launched it at our World Chef Congress in Korea in 2012, and so I admit I was often spying out what is happening around. So I was at your website at the time. It was really starting
Amazing.
point, and so it's actually quite interesting to see how you've grown. And because I remember it was just a UK
Yeah,
conversation at the time.
exactly.
Is it Blanc?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
who is still there, and
Yeah.
and now to see that it's now international and touches so many different parts of the world. As an organization, how have you developed working with other partners in industry or government bodies and or chef associations? What sort of approach do you take to collaboration with the community?
Yeah. So fundamentally, we believe that um, collaboration is the name of the game. And you mentioned I've been at the SRA for 10 years, but I really started leading the SRA. I became the managing director and then CEO in 2020. So in this kind of post-COVID kind of shift period for us. Um, and for me, my kind of strategic priority is very much that collaboration and that human element to our industry. I think that there are a lot of tools out there that are kind of pitching to measure your impact or to, be a platform that sort of measures these things for you. And I think our perspective is that what those things get wrong is how human that we are that at the end of the day, and how what we actually want is to build that network within our industry of sharing ideas across the board, sharing best practice, inviting that communication and things in. The other thing I think that is important in collaboration, and definitely something that I have experienced over and over in my career, is that a key part of collaboration is knowing which part of the puzzle you do really well, and which part of the puzzle, and not then trying to do the other parts of the puzzle, right? So for us, what we recognized is that there's a real gap in the market in the framework that we offer, in that we understand the interconnectivity of all of these issues that we just talked about and our sector better than I think, I don't mean it in a sort of tooting our own horn way, but in a sort of we've been diving into that complexity for 18 years now. And so we understand all those things better than ever before. What we don't do, um, is what World's Association of Chefs does, and what kind of these chef congresses do. We don't do what lobbying bodies do in other, in other countries. What we don't do is, map suppliers, for example, in any given region. So we've become really clear on kind of who we are and what we do, which I think makes us easy to collaborate with, because we're able to sort of say, here's what we can add to your existing relationships, and here are the relationships that we can share with you. What that looks like in real practice is particularly in markets where we don't have um, a history, or we're only just entering the market. So I'm going to use Taiwan here as an example, where there's an organization in Taiwan that is called the Green Dining Guide in Taiwan. Which I think probably, like you mentioning in, scurrying around the internet in 2019, they were familiar with our framework. They saw what we were doing in the UK. They kind of created a green restaurants pledge in Taiwan to kind of support those principles, and have been growing since. And they've got an audience. They work with, 500 restaurants in Taiwan. They're very well connected to government and to sort of lobbying, particularly on agricultural policy and those relationships with farmers. We're not by any means trying to compete with that or say, this is a different association to join. Instead, what we say is we want to amplify the things that are happening in Taiwan so that others internationally can learn from that good practice. And food made good as a standard, as an assessment, becomes a tool for comparability. So if some of these restaurants in Taiwan complete the food made good standard, you see where they sit in that global picture. Um, and therefore we are partners in that mission and in that vision. Similarly, in Scandinavia, we're working quite closely with what is the Circular Gastronomy Challenge in Sweden, which is all about innovation in the industry on circularity and how we drive innovation. Similarly working, with big hotel groups across the world to say, how do you we are one standard that you can roll out across the world, that has flexibility for local nuance within it. So, different ways, different bodies, but very much take a fundamentally, we all want to see a better industry together. We want an industry that is resilient to all of the challenges that we are facing, and that's going to take all of us doing our own, little pieces of the puzzle.
Mm. Yeah, amazing. And also, you mentioned that people have access to the standards and the way you assess. How about education? Do you also provide helping people to reach the standards? Do you focus on educating? Uh,
Yeah, so we do this in sort of two key ways. So the first is that every business that signs up for the Food Made Good standard has access to our knowledge library, and our knowledge library has is a real hub for toolkits, for guidance, for policy templates, etc. Where you can dive into particular issues, you can learn more about them. We are adding more to that on a monthly basis to really respond to, and a lot of it is informed by what we see as being gaps when we are doing assessments over and over again. We see that, you know, this kind of restaurant in Asia is none of them have fishing guidance that makes sense to them. So let's do a deep dive on what does fishing look, what is fishing good practice in this area. So that's our knowledge library and our knowledge hub. With that, we do host webinars and things on particular subject matters. We also offer bespoke training for businesses if they have a particular business need that they want to dive into. So we have done, for example, sourcing and supply chain workshops for some of the for global hotels, or we do a really simple sustainability 101 that just helps your team understand what are these big picture global issues that and how does hospitality connect to them. Um, but I appreciate that that's not, some of that stuff is behind the sort of paywall of being involved in the Food Made Good standard. And what we really want is to drive change across the entire industry, not just those that are already kind of committed to participating in an assessment framework. And that's where I can't recommend highly enough to check out our social channels. At Food Made Good on Instagram is a treasure trove of case studies and stories from operators on a specific issue or a specific challenge. And a lot of that then links through. We've got a very active news and insights page on our website where we are publishing deep dives constantly. I think this week or this month, maybe it's not this week, there's a deep dive going on avocado supply chains and kind of understanding avocado supply chains, which is really complicated and complex, and especially with the growing popularity of people serving avocados around the world. So something as, kind of specific and deep divey as that. But if you zoom out, last month there was case studies and stories about what good leadership looks like in hospitality. And we had stories from, we had video stories from operators in the UK, in Sweden, in Colombia, in the US, all kind of sharing their experiences of what makes good leadership, future fit leadership run in their organizations. So we've got a wealth of knowledge there, and some of it for those businesses that are doing assessments, some of it for those that are just beginning on their journey.
Mm. And so when you are doing these assessments and across the thousands of kitchens that you've been assessing, do you see, like, is there a most common room for improvement, where particularly is there like a first focal point, or do you see industry doing well in some other areas? And And have you
Yeah,
seen any
it's a
sort of
really
transformation of any industry, but any kitchen in particular who has done really well in transforming themselves?
yeah, so I think there is some really kind of interesting patterns
Mhm.
to highlight. Um, the real sort of opportunity for businesses that are just getting started on their journey is to look at that environmental impact section. And the reason is because that is where it's all about efficiencies that drive savings. And so if you can reduce your food waste, if you can reduce your energy consumption, two big things in particular, increasingly, if you can reduce your water consumption, because increasingly water is under pressure in multiple parts of the world. I know you're joining today from southern Spain, where that's very prevalent. Here in the UK, we have a number of hose pipe bans that are in effect because of our temperatures and um, uh, over recent times and the lack of rain here in the UK. So really driving efficiencies on your food waste, your energy use, and your water consumption are places that sort of grow your bottom line, or sorry, grow your revenue because they decrease your bottom line. Um, and we see time and time again that, we've got some good case studies, for example, on food waste, ways that people either use technology to really help them or just manual audits. So we've got sort of templates for you to run a really simple, really basic audits using a kitchen scale to actually understand where your waste is coming from. Chefs are notoriously challenging with saying we don't waste in our kitchen. Of course, we don't waste in our kitchen. And I appreciate that chefs have a very keen eye always on GP and what's going into their dishes. Unfortunately, we've built wastage into the business model of how we operate kitchens, and now is the time for us to really interrogate that and drive it down. Even though we're sort of thinking of that as already priced, there's real opportunities and gains to be made in actually doing an audit, understanding what goes in your bins, and then seeing how you can manipulate that. The thing that we tend to find is that bigger operators, so in the UK we would call them high street chains, multi-site operators, big food service companies, etc. Those guys have been doing a lot on food waste in the last, 5, sometimes 10 years. Because this is where you see increase in profitability if you really focus on that. So some really impressive savings have been made across some of those operators, and this tends to be something that smaller kitchens are actually the ones that are not as good at as bigger operators. Um, and flip side, though, smaller kitchens tend to be better at supply chain stuff and traceability, especially kind of a more classical restaurant or a chef-driven restaurant. Chefs are very attached to understanding where their food comes from, the quality of those ingredients, etc. So traceability and transparency tends to be a bigger challenge for the bigger guys, and the little guys tend to know what at the farm level where their ingredients are coming from. And so for big guys, we would say you need to start focusing your attention on that traceability and that transparency. Because as operators and chefs will know, we have an increasingly unstable global food system and global supply chain. That's why we are experiencing rising costs across food. We're seeing shortages of ingredients that are driving costs up. We are seeing droughts in places that previously didn't have droughts, floods in places that previously didn't have floods, etc. Also, global, geopolitical instability that, we see war in Ukraine causes wheat prices to skyrocket. We see, fertilizer prices are going to skyrocket after what's going on in Iran. Um, so now, previously, I think we thought of supply, of the provenance of our ingredients as a sort of value add, as this, more premium kind of problem to look at. It's increasingly becoming a resilience problem, and we need that traceability and transparency of what's going into your supply chain so that you can manage the risks that are in that supply chain going forward. So that's another sort of really key area to look at. And then finally, to bring us back around that triangle that we've been talking about the whole time, staffing and people
Yeah.
is a fundamental thing that we have to get a grip on in our industry. Again, to talk about resilience, because we know most major markets are experiencing shortages in kind of good high quality hospitality staff, and that comes after years of lack of real valuing all of the different people that go into our industry to make it run. Um, and the businesses that really confront that head on and kind of take a real meaningful step into how they manage people and what leading with purpose looks like, see that return massively, because turnover is one of the biggest wastes of money in our industry. Having to rehire, retrain constantly is a real drain on our businesses. And so the more that we can recruit to retain the talent that we have, the better we are in the long term.
Mm. No, absolutely. And you made some very sort of recent happenings in around us, from COVID to wars and drought and natural disasters that are sort of awakening awakeners. Do you see there has been a big evolution since you started approaching companies with those topics? Is there a different enthusiasm from the younger generation, do you see, or not? Or do you see there's a change
Yeah,
in
it's such
attitudes?
it's such an interesting conversation. And I think that quite often when there are people that are talking about sustainability, we do have a sort of reflex to say younger people care more. And I think there's some interesting stuff going on if you actually dive into the data on this. And so actually the sort of demographic that is the most proactive and the most engaged is actually more my sort of generation of millennials and the both sort of younger and elder millennial generation are the and what's interesting about us is that we are now at management, senior management sort of levels in that. So that is driving a change in terms of awareness. One of the challenges that we are facing is that young people we see, if we're talking now kind of Gen Z and younger Gen Zs that are coming into the workforce in hospitality, we see higher levels of knowledge about sustainability than sort of ever before, but also increasing levels of skepticism and sort of scrutiny. There's definitely more fear that nothing matters anymore, that that it's sort of the damage is done. People are living with kind of high levels of underlying climate anxiety or anxiety around global instability and just uncertainty in general that is facing all of us. Um, and we've lived through, and especially if you think about these young people kind of coming of age through really turbulent 10 years. Whether that starts pre-COVID in a place like the UK where I am with Brexit in 2016, whether that starts with the first election of Donald Trump in 2016 in the US, like we sort of this last 10 years is really marked as a period of increasing polarization, increasing skepticism, increasing insecurity and uncertainty about your place in the world and what your future is in it. That all being said, to say that more important than ever that hospitality businesses recognize that they have a role to play here. We are disproportionate employers of young people as a sector internationally across the board. We're so we have, and what we do see is that the businesses that really lean in to their purpose, that they really show those people that they have a proactive way of managing their environmental impact or their social impact, has a disproportionate effect on how then young people feel empowered and their role in the world. So we really have a moment that we are in around needing to make sure that we don't all just devolve into cynics and skeptics around the future kind of food system that we want to see. Your part of your question though also just is about post-COVID, are we seeing a rise in sort of interest and all of that? And I think one of the things that feels really palpable to me is that we've talked about the young people, but what about the senior leaders? And I think from senior leadership, we have seen a real transformation of sustainability as a nice to have. Okay, you want us to be good people, like maybe we'll be good people, but to actually sustainability is fundamentally about the resilience of our business and the resilience of us being able to continue to operate in an increasingly challenging trade environment. And that absolutely has gone up. And I think because COVID, the idea that restaurants would close for a global pandemic and it would be across markets, the whole world would shut down, was not something that was ever on a CEO's risk register or a head chef's risk register.
Yeah.
Um, Now that it happened, there's all of a sudden, what are all these other things that were sort of bubbling around as a risk register that we hadn't paid attention to? Shoot, we probably should start paying attention to those things. And so visibility of the ways that, for example, the cost of fertilizer skyrocketing in Iran is going to have a knock-on impact on our ability to buy tomatoes in a year's time. We're seeing an increasing understanding from CEOs who never had looked at those things before.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's super interesting, and I think people. I would urge everybody to check out your social media and your website to understand more and maybe take action today if you have a restaurant or you're an employee to start to inform yourself and so you have access. One can have access to information on through your website.
Yes, absolutely. So check us out. Instagram at Food Made Good is a great place to start. And then our website is thesra.org. So thesra.org. And loads on there, news and insights. If anybody that's listening is interested in having a conversation about what this could look like in your business, please don't hesitate to reach out. On our website, you can find everything from WhatsApp to emails, etc., to get a hold of our team and be part of this conversation. And I'm hopeful that we can continue to talk as well about the things, the goings on in your world, and continue
Absolutely.
to showcase some of the great things that are coming out of those activities as well.
Yeah, we're looking forward to have that conversation. So I just want to thank you, Juliane, for joining us today. It's been great listening to you, and it's a fascinating organization and doing so much good. And hopefully we can be working together in the future just to spread the word and the impact. So
Amazing.
great to hear about your work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your time, and have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for listening. You're listening to World Chef Podcast. I'm your host, Ragnar Friedrichsen. This is World on a Plate. Thank you and take care. Bye bye.